All right, 10th grade, we are now going to be looking at industrialization outside of Europe. This is going to be a longer process than just this lecture. Especially when we get into imperialism, we'll be going more in depth about how non-European states respond both to industrialization and imperialism. But today we want to get the basic outline of what happened when industrialization spread outside of Europe and reasons why it took so long to do so. So let's get started. Sorry, I had to check something real fast. So let's get started. Industrialization outside of Europe. Of course, we're in period 5 still. So this should say what stopped industrialization. Basically, the idea here is that we want to really quick touch upon why didn't non-European states industrialize when Europe industrialized. Europe spent a long time, all the way from the 1700s to the 1800s, industrializing. So why didn't other states jump onto that before they were forced to? First, production. We talk about production a lot, but the basic idea here is that many non-European countries, Ottoman Empire, Egypt, Qing, Japan, India, Russia, all of them produced a lot of goods without the industrial system. And they felt confident that their economic system was still successful. Not only that, they still had systems like the guild system, which kept people in power who did not want change. They liked the same rules they've always had. They liked the consistent wealth they made off that, which stifled innovation that was needed for industrialization to happen. Not only that, who's in power matters a lot for why industrialization did not happen in these states. First, we often had emperors or kings and rulers who relied upon the landed nobility for power. The landed nobility made all their money from agricultural production or from resources that were used in smaller guild businesses. The point being is that it would be against the interests of the landed nobility for their country to industrialize. They would most likely lose money and lose power. So they often supported the king in not, or supporting the ruler in not industrializing and consistently trying to prevent that because they wanted to maintain their power. You also had religious leaders in power, and religions tend to do not want change. Religions like the way things are. And so these religions were afraid that industrialization would lead to European influences, Enlightenment influences, which would decrease their power. So religions such as Islam and Confucianism and others encouraged the status quo and for there to be little change. So this basically made it so all the way to the 1800s, most of the gunpowder empires we talked about and other smaller kingdoms did not industrialize. They viewed the Europeans as doing things that didn't really matter to them and that they were fine. Eventually, though, in the 1800s, European industrial power became too large to ignore. With that in mind, we're going to pause here and you're going to answer question 1 about why non-Eurasian states tended... I'm sorry. You're going to pause here and answer question 1 about why non-European states tended to not industrialize. So hypothetically, if you answer question 1, we're going into why did the Industrial Revolution happen in non-European states and what the effects of that were. First, war. Almost every non-European country began to industrialize because of failure in war. Failure in war is the thing that really wakes up a country and its ruler to their weaknesses. And once they realize they are weak, they're more willing to change. So a pattern you see is that failure in warfare directly causes changes like industrialization. And they often have to decide, do we industrialize? Do we copy European culture and values as well, known as Westernization? So what we're going to go through now is an outline of the average timeline of this change. Basically, we're going to go on more deep dives of specific empires and what they did later on. But what we want to do is see what was the usual path of this reform and industrialization, what usually ended up happening, and then see some basic examples. So, what did this reform look like? Usually what happened is that a country would lose in war, or an empire would lose in war. This woke them up to the fact that, man, European industrial powers have a lot better weapons, they're a lot stronger. This would lead to a push for new education. Two things would either happen, or a combination of these two as well. European experts would be brought into the empire to teach people new skills, new technology, new techniques. Not only that, people would be sent from the empire to European countries to get a European education. What this would cause is usually a rise of an urban, European educated elite who wanted the country to act a lot more European and adopt European ideas. What this usually meant was that this urban, educated elite would want the following things: Enlightenment rights, a de-emphasis of religion, some sort of representative government, or at least a government that protected people's rights, a constitution and government that promised the protection of rights, economic freedom as seen in Europe, and more investment in industry and industrialization. And overall, a culture that would mimic more urban European culture. This, at first, would often succeed. You would have governments start to promise more rights. Maybe some governments would actually start having voting, would allow representation, would encourage more European cultural habits, would have more European-based education, and de-emphasize religion. You also had governments who started investing heavily in industrialization. This is a key that we need to understand. Industrialization outside of Europe, I'm saying this slow because it's important. Industrialization outside of Europe was often paid for and invested in by the government. These countries rarely had private citizens who had the wealth or the want to industrialize, and so government often paid for industrialization, paying for factories, paying for the machinery, running these businesses. So this is heavily government encouraged. So governments would often, one, encourage the growing of cash crops to make money, and then pay for and create industrialization within the country. Industry, things like that. They would also often create modern European-style armies and copy industrial weaponry. Overall, this is very expensive. So a common effect of that was that governments had to tax the lower class heavily to pay for things. So often the lower class itself was against these changes as it hurt them economically through increased taxation. What would usually happen is that a counter reform would happen. A group would rise that would be against all these changes that just happened. This group was usually heavily conservative and made up of the nobility and religious elite. The nobility did not like the changes. They liked an absolute ruler who supported their interests. They also did not like industrialization as they were losing wealth and power, so they would want things to go back to normal. The religious elite would be upset about the de-emphasis of religion and believe that the changes would hurt their power as well. So usually this group would rise up, often with support of the lower class, to push back against these changes. Now, what happened depended on the empire. We'll get more in depth in those later on in the coming weeks. Whether the empire would successfully industrialize and maintain power and maintain independence, or an empire would fail in some way in their reforms and come under the influence of European powers. We're going to pause here, and you're going to answer question 2. Go ahead and go. Now we're heading to question in area 3, where we're going to give some basic examples of what this formula and outline we just talked about looks like in action. We're going to talk about all these areas again in more in depth, but I want you to see the thing I just talked about, what it looks like in some basic steps. First, Egypt. Egypt, entering the 1800s, was under the rule of emperors of the Mamluk dynasty. The French took over Egypt during the reign of Napoleon and introduced Enlightenment ideas, industrialization, things like that. Once the French left, the Egyptian realized, man, we are behind. We got our butts kicked by the French. They have better technology, they have better goods, and they seem just a lot more ahead of us than they realized. A leader, a former soldier by the name of Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, took over Egypt, and he decided that industrialization needed to happen now. This led to Muhammad Ali doing a few things. One, he encouraged a European-style education and sent Egyptians to go learn, and also brought in many French experts to come teach his people. He founded a modern army that copied the French style of fighting, and he also heavily encouraged industrialization. He, one, made Egypt start growing cash crops and became one of the largest producers of cotton in the world to make money to pay for this industrialization. He also encouraged local industrialization, built factories that was run by the Egyptian government. He also passed tariffs or taxes to protect his industry, and throughout the early 1800s, this was very successful. Egypt was starting to become an industrial power. Now, this required heavy taxation, and the peasants were often suffered because of this. Overall, this ended with the British removing Muhammad Ali for fear of Egyptian power, and the industrialization basically only reached halfway and failed. But Egypt became very close at modeling this industrialization that the Europeans went through. Our second example is the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire began losing a lot of wars in the late 1700s and realized that their once powerful empire was starting to crumble. What they decided they needed was to change and start copying the Europeans who were beating them constantly in battle. This was called the Tanzimat Reform, which was led by a group called the Young Ottomans. The Tanzimat Reform, at its core, basically copied European style of government. The rights that Europeans demanded, Enlightenment rights, started offering some of those. and it also tried to loosen up and take restrictions away from the economy. What happened was that for early on, the Tanzimat was relatively successful. The Sultan gave away some power, and they opened up the economy, made people equal. But in the end, not enough changes happened. The religious elite of the Ottoman Empire and the nobility of the Ottoman Empire had enough power to make sure the Tanzimat reform did not go all the way through, and they still maintained some of the power influence they had. And the Ottoman Empire eventually did not reform enough to protect itself. And once again, we'll get more into that later on. Finally, Japan, which is considered like the success story. Japan, once again, we see war. In this case, they didn't actually fight in a war, but American warships showed up in around 1868. And Japan realized, wow, we're really far behind. Japan also watched China get their butt kicked by England in the Opium War. So Japan went, all right, we need to basically give up everything we're doing and completely copy the Europeans. Japan did one of the most extreme examples of westernization and industrialization seen outside of Europe. They wholesale copied European culture, sending many Japanese to learn from Europeans and bringing European experts in. They fully industrialized, with the government heavily paid for industrialization and running many businesses, and trying to fully emulate Europe. In the end, they actually succeeded. We'll delve into more why later on, but in the end, they succeed, fully industrialized. In fact, Japan becomes one of the strongest non-European industrial powers in the world. You're going to pause here and answer question 3 about some of the similarities and differences we see in non-European states industrializing. And also, this is the end of our lecture. Au revoir.